The selection room smelled like burnt amber, and something older, something that reminded me of the inside of a troop carrier after a long haul. Metal, recycled air, and the faint anxiety of bodies that did not want to be there but had no real choice in the matter. I was the last candidate to arrive, not because I was late. I simply had no reason to rush. The other candidates had dressed for the occasion. A Drithani nobleman from the outer belt wore a ceremonial collar so tall it brushed the doorframe when he walked in. Two Solvarian delegates wore color-shifting fabric that rippled like oil on water every time they moved, clearly designed to draw the eye. A Marathi prince, whose species stood nearly 3 meters tall, had painted his forearm ridges in ceremonial gold. Everyone in that room had prepared something. Everyone wanted to be noticed. I was wearing the best jacket I owned. It was dark gray. It had been cleaned twice in the last week, which I considered adequate effort. My name is Owen Garrett. I was 41 years old, formerly attached to the 14th Cross-Species Diplomatic Liaison Corps, which is a title that sounds impressive until you learn that my primary job for the last 2 years had been translating trade agreements and attending dinners, where I was not allowed to eat the first 3 courses for allergy reasons. Before the Diplomatic Corps, I had done other work. Most people did not know about that. The vetting team for the board selection had been given my civilian jacket, which was thin and unremarkable, and they had apparently found it satisfactory. Nobody had asked the right questions. I took my seat at the far end of the candidate row and looked around the hall. The Hall of Accord in the Veiltheri Imperial Palace was large enough to land a mid-class shuttle inside it. The walls were made of a pale stone that seemed to breathe light rather than reflect it, shifting slowly between ivory and soft gold depending on how the overhead panels adjusted. There were no windows. Every wall was covered in carved record text, the Veilthari way of keeping history. Every treaty, every alliance, every act of state that had shaped the empire was written into the stone itself, so that the room you stood in was also a library that never let you forget where you were. I found it calming, actually. The court officials moved through the hall in long robes, speaking in low voices. Advisors clustered near the dais at the far end. Guards stood at every major column. I counted 14 visible, and estimated 4 more in positions I could not directly see from where I sat. The door arrangements suggested 2 additional entry points behind the main dais curtain. None of that was relevant information for what I was supposed to be doing here, which was sitting quietly and trying to look like an appropriate choice for a royal consort. I filed it away anyway. Old habits do not care about your current job title. Then Queen Saralith IV walked in and the entire room changed. I do not mean that in a poetic sense. The room physically changed. The light panels shifted to a deeper gold. The carved walls seemed to brighten, as though the record text itself recognized her presence and wanted to be read. The court officials straightened. The noble delegates sat up straighter. Even the Marathi prince, who was taller than most of the furniture in the hall, seemed to make himself more vertical. She walked without ceremony and without any apparent need for it. She was tall by human standards, maybe 15 centimeters above me, with the silver-blue skin that marked the Veilthari ruling line and eyes the color of deep water, a shade of blue-green that had no clean human equivalent. Her hair was dark and pulled back severely. She wore no crown. She wore a structured formal coat that closed at the neck and moved like armor even though it was clearly not. Her hands were at her sides, open, unhurried. She looked like someone who had been making difficult decisions since before she was old enough to want to, and had long since made peace with the weight of it. She reached the center of the hall and stopped. She looked at the candidate row. I watched her look at them. I did not watch her the way the other candidates were watching her. With performance, with readiness, with the particular energy of men and beings who are waiting to be chosen. I watched the way I had been trained to watch things, which meant I was reading the room through her eyes, noting what she noticed, tracking the small shifts in her expression that told you more than anything a briefing document could. She moved down the row. She paused at the Drethani nobleman, who gave a practiced bow. She paused at the Solvarian delegates, who rippled magnificently. She paused at the Marathi prince, who was genuinely impressive and knew it. Then she reached me. I had not stood up. I had not adjusted my jacket. I had not changed my expression, because my expression was the same one I had been wearing since I sat down. Alert, but not performing alertness. Comfortable, but not performing comfort. I was simply there, the way a piece of furniture is simply there, except furniture does not usually look back. She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. The hall was completely silent. I was not afraid of her. That was not bravado. I had been in places and situations that had permanently relocated my fear response to a quieter part of my mind. a part that only activated in response to very specific things, none of which were a queen looking at me across a polished stone floor. I was simply a man sitting in a chair, looking at a woman who happened to run an interstellar empire, thinking that the bread roll they had served with the introductory refreshments was actually quite good, and I wished I had taken a second one. She turned to her chief advisor, a tall Veilthari elder named Sorvek, and said something in low court speech. I caught 3 words. The Veilthari language had 17 registers, and I was fluent in 4 of them. The word she used was from the 5th register, one I had only ever heard used in historical texts about soldiers returning from long campaigns. The word meant, he has already been through the worst of it. Sorvek looked alarmed. He leaned in and spoke quickly. She listened. She did not change her expression. When he finished, she turned back to the room. She said, in common galactic speech so every candidate and official could hear it, I have made my selection. She looked directly at me. The human, she said, Owen Garrett. The room did not erupt. That would have been too simple. Instead, it did something more interesting. It went very still, the way a room goes still when everyone in it is working extremely hard not to say the thing they are currently thinking. The Drethani nobleman's collar seemed to wilt slightly. The Solvarian delegates stopped rippling. The Myrathi prince stared at me with an expression that I could only describe as personally offended on behalf of the concept of impressiveness itself. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. Sorvik appeared at my elbow within seconds, moving with the speed of a man who had been in crisis management for decades. He spoke quietly. I must inform you, Mr. Garrett, that the Queen's selection carries the full weight of Imperial protocol. You will be required to. I understood the briefing document, I said. He blinked. You read the full document? Both of them, I said, including the annexes. He looked at me differently then, not with respect. Exactly. More like a man who has just noticed that the object he picked up thinking it was decorative has an unexpected weight to it. I walked across the hall toward the dais where Sarilith was now standing, speaking in low tones to her senior advisors, who all appeared to be performing controlled panic at different volumes. She saw me approaching and dismissed them with a single gesture. Up close, she was more precise than she appeared from a distance. Everything about her face suggested a person who thought before speaking and intended every word she chose. She looked at me the way she had from across the room, not appraising, not calculating. Reading you were not afraid, she said. It was not a question. No, I said. Everyone else was afraid, she said. I know, I said. I noticed. She was quiet for a moment. Why weren't you? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I have been in enough situations where fear would have gotten me killed, I said. You spend long enough rewiring that response and it stops showing up when it is not useful. She processed that. Something shifted behind her eyes, not warmth exactly, but recognition, like a word in a foreign language she had only ever read before, and was now hearing spoken aloud for the first time. What did you do before the diplomatic corps, she asked. Other work, I said. She waited. I did not elaborate. She nodded once, slowly. The advisors behind her were watching with various degrees of distress. Sorvek had a small device in his hand that he appeared to be squeezing very hard. The stipend is generous, she said, with a tone I would later learn was her version of dry humor. And the rooms are adequate. I read that too, I said. The rooms are actually quite good. The annex mentioned heated floors. For one fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it, something crossed her face that was not a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. Welcome to the Imperial household, Owen Garrett, she said. I folded my jacket over my arm. Behind me, somewhere, the Myrathi prince made a sound that translated loosely as profound institutional disbelief. I walked forward, my file, sealed under a 7-tier clearance classification that the palace vetting team had not been authorized to access, sat undisturbed in an encrypted partition of the Interstellar Alliance database. It was 46 pages long, not counting the appendices. The first appendix alone was longer than most people's entire service records. No one here knew that. I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. After all, I had come here for the stipend and the heated floors. Everything else, I decided, I could figure out as I went. The first 3 weeks in the palace were genuinely the strangest of my life. That is a statement that requires some context, given that my life had included a 42-hour solo extraction from a station locked down by hostile forces, a 6-month undercover posting where I had been required to convincingly pretend to be a Drethani mining consultant, and a situation on the edge of the Karivan system that I still did not think about before sleeping if I could help it. But the palace was strange in a different way. It was strange the way very old, very complicated machinery is strange. Not because it is broken, But because there are so many moving parts and none of them are labeled, and everyone around you seems to have been born, understanding how it all fits together, while you are still looking for a way in. There were rules about which corridors were available to me at which hours. There were rules about which officials I was permitted to address directly, and which required an intermediary. There were rules about meals, about formal appearances, about the specific way a consort of the third tier, which was my current ceremonial rank, was supposed to position himself during public events. I read everything they gave me. I asked questions when the answers were not in the documents. I did not complain, because I had been in environments where complaining was not an option, and the habit had stayed with me. The palace staff, for the most part, treated me with a kind of professional warmth that was indistinguishable from careful neutrality. They were polite. They were efficient. They answered my questions without extra information and asked none of their own. I respected that. It was honest. The nobles were a different matter. There were 3 major noble houses with standing representation in the imperial court. House Velkar held military titles and the loyalty of the Eastern garrison forces. House North controlled most of the trade routes through the inner system. House Aerith was older than the other 2, and considerably richer, with bloodlines so thoroughly documented and cross-referenced that their family genealogists had required a dedicated wing of the Imperial Library. For the last 2 centuries, all 3 houses had presented candidates for the Accord selection. All 3 candidates had been passed over in favor of a human with a gray jacket and an unremarkable diplomatic career. None of the 3 houses were particularly pleased about this. I understood their position. If I had been in their place, I would not have been pleased either. A human with no dynastic weight, no visible credentials, and no apparent reason to be chosen over 3 carefully prepared candidates from established houses was a confusing result by any reasonable political calculation. From their perspective, the Queen had made an error. From my perspective, she had made a decision they did not have enough information to evaluate yet. That gap between their certainty and my silence was something I intended to maintain for as long as it was useful. They did not say so directly. That would have been beneath their station. Instead, they expressed their displeasure through the specific language of court, which is the language of politeness deployed as a precision instrument. Lord Aerith stopped just short of warmth every time he addressed me and managed to communicate, in the gap between courtesy and cold, that he considered my presence in the palace an administrative error that would eventually be corrected. Lady Velkar asked me, at a formal dinner during my 2nd week, what I had done in my service years, a question that sounded conversational and was not. When I said translation and liaison work, she smiled in a way that said she found this information satisfying. I let her keep her satisfaction. It cost me nothing, and uninformed opponents are easier to manage than informed ones. Duke Norath was more direct, in the way that people who have always had power can afford to be. He arranged a challenge. The challenge of worth was, according to the document I read the night before it happened, an ancient Fetal Thuri tradition originally designed to allow noble houses to formally contest appointments they considered inadequate. It had not been invoked in 60 years. Duke Norath had apparently decided 60 years was long enough. The challenge required the consort to accept a nominated proxy competition, a structured test of some capacity deemed relevant to the imperial household. The Duke's nomination was a physical endurance trial. The logic was obvious. The Veilthari ruling line valued a physical strength. His proxy was a house champion, a Veilthari male named Corvin, who was built like a load-bearing wall and had competed in imperial games 3 times. My handler, a young palace official named Philip Dane, who had been assigned to help me navigate court life, and who had been visibly anxious since the day we met, came to me the evening before the challenge looking like a man who had not slept and was not expecting to. "You do not have to accept," he said. "There are procedural grounds to dispute." "I accepted it this morning," I said. He stared at me. "You when?" "I sent the formal response through Sorvek at 9. It should be in the daily protocol record." Philip sat down heavily in the chair near the window. "Mr. Garrett, Corvin held the Imperial Endurance record for 4 consecutive years. He is physiologically—" "I read his record," I said. "You have access to his record." I asked Sorvik for it. He seemed surprised by the request, but he sent it. Philip rubbed his face with both hands. He was young, maybe 26, and he had the particular energy of someone who was very good at their job, and had recently discovered that their job had become significantly more complicated. I liked him. He worked hard, he paid attention, and he was not yet cynical enough to stop trying, which I found refreshing. What are you going to do? He asked. Compete, I said. He is going to be faster than you, Philip said carefully. He is going to be stronger than you. The court has already filled the observation gallery. The Duke invited 30 witnesses. He is expecting a visible result. Philip, I said, what is the one physical category in which humans are the statistical outliers across every known sapient species? He blinked. Endurance, he said slowly. Endurance, I agreed. Long distance, sustained output. Humans evolved as persistence hunters. We were built to keep going after everything else has stopped. It is not glamorous and it does not look impressive in the early stages, but it does tend to produce a result. He was quiet. You have done this before. Not exactly this, I said, something analogous, several times. He looked at me with the expression I was beginning to recognize as his version of a recalibration. The face he made when new information required him to update a working assumption. I will have your kit ready at dawn, he said. The trial the next morning was held in the palace training ground with about 40 court observers, which told me the Duke had been certain enough of the outcome to invite witnesses. Corvin looked at me the way large beings generally look at me, with the particular brand of dismissiveness that assumes size is the whole story. He was polite about it. The Veilthari are not an unkind species, but the dismissiveness was real. The trial was a sustained circuit, repeated sets of physical tasks across a measured course, for as long as both participants could continue. There was no time limit. It ended when one person stopped. Corvin was extraordinary for the first 2 hours. He was fast, he was powerful, and he completed each circuit with the efficiency of someone who had been training for exactly this, since before I was born. The court observers were appreciative. I heard them commenting on his form, his speed, his endurance capacity. None of them were commenting on me, which was fine. I was not as fast, I was not as powerful. I ran my own pace, which was not impressive to watch. I breathed evenly. I kept my heart rate managed. I had learned a long time ago that the body is an instrument, and you get more out of it when you play it correctly, rather than loudly. I had learned that on a training course that no longer existed under that name, in a facility that was now listed on official records as a decommissioned agricultural station. At the 3-hour mark, Corvin's form began to shift. Small things. His stride shortened slightly. His breathing deepened. These are normal signs of fatigue and they mean nothing on their own, but I was watching his rhythm and I could read the slope of it, the rate at which it was changing, what it would look like at 4 hours. At 5. At the 4-hour mark, he was working hard to maintain what the first hour had cost him nothing. I was still running my pace. The gallery had gone quiet. This was not the silence of boredom. It was the silence of people watching something that was not going the way they expected and not quite being sure when they had stopped understanding what they were looking at. At 4 hours and 37 minutes, Corvin stopped. He did not fall. He was not injured. He simply reached the point where the cost of continuing exceeded what his body could currently pay, and he stopped with the dignity of a champion who understood the line between effort and damage. I respected that. Knowing when to stop is its own kind of skill. I completed the circuit I was on, finished at the marker, and stopped. The training ground was quiet for a long moment. I walked over to Corvin, who was sitting on a bench with a hydration unit and the expression of a man re-evaluating several assumptions. I sat next to him because I also needed to sit, and because sitting next to him seemed more honest than standing over him. Good trial, I said. He looked at me sideways. How long could you have continued? I thought about it honestly. Probably another hour, maybe 90 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. You did not run to beat me, he said. You ran to outlast me. Yes, I said. That is a different thing, he said. Most things are when you look at them the right way, I said. He nodded slowly, with the considered respect of someone who had just learned something he had not expected to learn. I will tell the Duke that the challenge was a mistake, he said. You do not have to, I said. I know, he said. I want to. We sat on the bench together for another few minutes without speaking, both of us cooling down from different amounts of effort. One of the court observers had moved to the edge of the training ground and was watching us with an expression I could not fully read from that distance, but I noted their house colors and filed that away. Corvin asked me, before we stood to leave, where I had learned to move the way I did. I told him service training. He accepted that the way people accept an answer that is technically true, but structurally incomplete. His people were not so different from mine in that respect. When someone gave you a partial answer with a settled expression, you understood that the full answer was theirs and was not on offer. You are not what anyone expected, he said. I know, I said. Is that deliberate? He asked. I thought about it honestly. It is not entirely deliberate, I said. But I have never corrected wrong assumptions about me, unless correcting them was necessary. Incorrect assumptions are frequently more useful than correct ones. From whose perspective, he asked. Mine, I said. He made a short sound that I decided was the Veil-Thari equivalent of a dry laugh and walked back toward the main wing. I watched him go. He was a good person who had been handed a bad assignment by someone who had not thought carefully enough about what they were deploying him against. I heard later that he did exactly that. The Duke did not arrange a second challenge, and at the next formal dinner he spoke to me first, which in court terms was a meaningful adjustment. Philip came to me afterward, still carrying the look of a man who had survived something he had not expected to survive. You called it a light workout, he said, in the official response log. When Sorvek asked for your assessment of the trial, you wrote, light workout, no concerns. It was accurate, I said. Mr. Garrett, he said carefully, people are starting to talk about you. I know, I said. What they are saying is not entirely comfortable, he said. Also accurate, I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then settled for, is there anything I should be worried about? I thought about the man I had found unconscious in the corridor outside my quarters 4 days earlier. A man I had recognized from a briefing file as a low-level intelligence asset working for House Velkar's private network. I thought about the quiet conversation I had with him before returning him to the corridor in a position that would look like a simple fall. I thought about the small listening device I had found behind the heating panel in my main room on the second day, and the replacement device I had installed in its place, which broadcast a very convincing simulation of my daily routine, while telling me nothing useful and the listener nothing useful. No, I said, nothing to worry about. Philip looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a man who suspected that answer was not the full truth but had decided, for the good of his own peace of mind, to accept it. Good, he said. Because the Queen has requested your presence for the afternoon review of the Western Trade Delegation and I still need to brief you on the correct seating protocol. I nodded. I picked up my jacket. That evening, after the trade review, I walked the Eastern Corridor as I did most evenings, not because I needed to go that way, but because the Eastern Corridor gave me a clean line of sight to the secondary guard station near the Queen's private wing. I had been walking it every evening for 11 days. Tonight, for the second time, I saw two faces at the station that I did not recognize. Guard rotations ran on a fixed schedule. I had memorized the schedule on day 3. These two were not on it. I noted the time. I noted their positions. I noted the way one of them glanced at a point further down the corridor, not at a threat but at something expected. The glance of someone checking a signal point. I walked past without changing pace. Back in my quarters, I wrote nothing down. I kept it where it belonged, in the part of my mind that had been trained for exactly this. The part that sorted information into patterns and held them until the pattern was complete enough to act on. The pattern was not complete yet, but it was building, and somewhere in the palace, Seralith was reading reports, making decisions, running an empire. She had started, I had noticed, to look at me differently. Not with concern, not with suspicion. With the careful, quiet attention of someone who had chosen something on instinct and was beginning to understand that her instinct had been reading something true. She was not wrong, but the conversation that would confirm it was still coming. We had time. Not as much as I would have liked, but enough. I reviewed the guard rotation one more time that night before sleeping, cross-checking the names on the Eastern Station against the full palace staffing record I had memorized during my first week. The 2 additions were listed under the name of a garrison administrator I did not recognize, which was itself a small irregularity. Temporary transfers of this kind were typically authorized by the head of palace security, whose name I did know. I made a note of the administrator's name on the same physical sheet I had used for the other items, folded it, and kept it in the inner pocket of the jacket hanging behind my door. Then I went to sleep, because operational readiness requires actual rest, and I had long since stopped allowing anxiety to interfere with the things that kept me functional. You learn that discipline early, or you do not survive long enough to develop it later. Sleep was not a luxury. It was a requirement, the same as water and food, and treating it as less than that was how people made errors at critical moments. The palace settled around me as I lay in the dark. Somewhere outside, the night guard completed their rotation on schedule. The heating in the floor panels shifted down to the overnight setting. I listened to the building breathe. I was not afraid. I was, as I had been for most of my adult life, simply ready. That was enough to sleep on. The man who came to me was named Director Aldrin Croft, and he was one of those people who had spent so long in intelligence work that discomfort had become his default setting. He did not knock. He used the secondary access to my quarters, the route I had identified on my second day as the path used by palace security for unscheduled checks. which told me he wanted this conversation off the formal record. He arrived at 6 in the morning, holding a data slate in both hands with the expression of someone carrying something they would greatly prefer to put down. I was already awake. I had been awake since 5, reading through the trade delegation reports from the previous afternoon and cross-referencing them with shipping manifests. I had no official reason to have access to, but had quietly obtained through Philip, who had stopped asking why I needed things and had moved into a phase of efficient, silent cooperation that I respected deeply. Croft stopped in the center of the room. He looked at me. He looked at the data slate. He looked at me again. "Mr. Garrett," he said. His voice was very controlled. "We have a situation." "Sit down," I said. "The coffee is fresh." He sat. He did not touch the coffee. He placed the data slate on the table between us, and then put both hands in his lap and looked at me with eyes of a man who had just read 46 pages plus appendices, and was now sitting across from the subject of those pages and was finding the experience considerably more disorienting than his training had prepared him for. "We were tracking an access attempt," he said. "External origin. Linked to Theskari Imperial Intelligence. They were building a file on the Queen's household. Standard surveillance architecture." He paused. "When they attempted to access your civilian personnel record, the query was intercepted by our monitoring systems. Standard procedure. We opened a mirror trace to identify what they were looking for." He stopped. I poured myself more coffee. "The trace took us to a partitioned file within the Alliance military database," he said. "The partition was flagged at classification Tier 7. "I know what tier it is," I said. He absorbed that without expression. It was good professional control. Tier 7 required a joint authorization from 3 separate Alliance intelligence directors. It took me 4 hours and 2 diplomatic calls to obtain the necessary clearance. He looked at the slate. "I need to ask. You want to know if it is accurate," I said. "I want to know if the man described in that file is the same man who has been attending trade delegation reviews and eating bread rolls at formal dinners for the last 3 weeks. "Yes," I said. He absorbed that. "The siege of Karevan Station," he said. His voice had taken on the careful quality of someone reading a briefing they are still processing. "The file states you held a secondary access corridor alone for 38 hours against rotating assault teams, while the rest of your unit was extracted. It states that when the relief team arrived, you were the only one still at the position. The corridor was held." "Yes," I said. "The Null Corridor Offensive," he said. "You were listed as the operational lead on a 7-person insertion team that disabled the primary relay network of the Theskari forward fleet. The mission was assessed at a 93% probability of total team loss. All 7 returned." "We were fortunate," I said. Croft looked at me with an expression that made it clear he did not accept that answer but recognized that I would not give him a different one. "The burning of the Theskari relay," he said. He turned to a second page, then a third. "The commendations list." He stopped. He looked up. "Mr. Garrett, the commendations list requires a second page." "I know," I said. "You retired 4 years ago," he said. "The record states voluntary retirement, full honors, psychological evaluation cleared, no ongoing obligations." He closed the slate. "Why did you come here?" "The diplomatic work was genuinely fine," I said. "The stipend here is better and the floors are heated." He looked at me. He was trying to decide if I was being evasive. I was not being evasive. Both of those things were true. "Does she know?" he said. "No," I said. "You did not tell her. No one asked the right questions." I answered everything I was asked honestly. Croft set his hands flat on the table. "I have to inform her." "I know," I said. "I expected it eventually." "How long did you think it would stay buried?" "Long enough for her to form her own opinion of me without the file as interference," I said. I was concerned that if she knew immediately, the record would become the room. That she would see the file rather than the person. She chose me for a reason that had nothing to do with what is in that document. I wanted her to have time to trust that reason before she had to recalibrate it. Croft was quiet for a long time. The palace was beginning to wake up around us. The change of guard in the outer yard. The low tones of the morning announcement system. The small sounds of an institution opening its eyes. "She is going to want to speak with you directly," he said. "I know," I said. "Is there anything in that file?" he said carefully. "That she is going to find alarming?" I thought about it honestly. "She is going to find it significant," I said. "Whether she finds it alarming depends entirely on how she frames it." He stood, picked up the data slate, and paused at the door. "Mr. Garrett," he said. He seemed to be deciding whether to say the next part. He said it. "I have worked in palace intelligence for 22 years. I have read a great many files. Yours is," he stopped. "Considerable," he said. He stood in the doorway another moment. "The Theskari asset who made the initial access attempt We traced their full query log. They were not only looking at your file. They were looking for anything in the household that represented an unpredicted variable. They found your civilian record, concluded you were not a variable, and closed the inquiry. I know, I said. Croft looked at me carefully. You anticipated that assessment. I relied on it, I said. An incorrect assessment of what I represent is one of the most useful things I carry. I did not want the Theskari correcting their model before I had a clear picture of what they were planning. He absorbed that. You have been thinking several moves ahead since you arrived, he said. I have been paying attention, I said. That is a different thing. He left. The summons came at 10. Philip delivered it in person, face carefully neutral, which meant the channel was quiet and he had already been told enough to understand why. He handed me the sealed note and said nothing. I opened it, read it, and nodded. Philip, I said. Sir, he said, how are you feeling about all of this? He thought about it with the honest care he gave everything. I feel professionally embarrassed that external intelligence found the file before. Our own team did, he said. I also believe, personally not officially, that the fact that you are here is good for the palace. And for her. He paused. I should have dug further in the initial vetting. I will not make that error again. You could not have accessed the partition, I said. It required 3 directors. This was not a vetting failure, he nodded. But the set of his expression said he would hold himself to the higher standard regardless. I thought, not for the first time, that he was going to be excellent at whatever he eventually chose to do. Before I left for the private chamber, I stood at Philip's window for a moment and looked out at the courtyard below. There were things I had not told Croft yet, not because I was withholding information that would be useful to him. But some things were still in the stage of being a feeling rather than a fact, and I had a long-standing habit of not presenting feelings as facts until they had developed into something more solid. The feeling was this. Someone inside the palace, at a level above the unscheduled guards, had known about the intelligence probe on my file before Croft's team had detected it. It was not evidence. It was a pattern. 3 unrelated events in the past 2 weeks had timed against each other in a way that was statistically unlikely to be coincidence. The contact observation window had opened precisely when the listening device signal went quiet. The state dinner guest list additions had arrived through a channel that bypassed one of the standard security review steps, signed off at a level that should have required an additional signature and had not received one. Small things. The kind of small things that were only visible if you were looking for them from a specific angle. Someone had been managing their operation around the possibility that they were being watched. That was a different caliber of concern than I had started the week with. It meant the network was more sophisticated than the initial assessment suggested, and it meant there was a possibility that my own behavior in the preceding weeks had been observed more closely than I had accounted for. I ran back through the previous 14 days, every decision, every movement, every conversation. I found 3 moments where my behavior could have been read as unusual by someone paying close attention. 3 moments was not comfortable, but it was workable, provided I moved correctly from here. I kept it in the part of my mind where I kept things that were not ready to be said yet. I would present it to Croft when it had taken shape. Philip looked at me from his desk. He had the good professional instinct to look at his work rather than at me while I was thinking. Sir, he said quietly. Yes, I said. Whatever you are working through, he said. I trust that you are working through it correctly. I looked at him. He kept his eyes on his screen. Thank you, Philip, I said. The Queen is waiting, he said. The private chamber where Seralith received me was a working space, long table, covered in the organized complexity of active governance, shelved documents, a window that let in the pale morning light of the inner courtyard. She was standing at the window when I arrived. Croft and Sorvik were both present. She dismissed them both with a gesture before I had fully entered the room, and the door closed, and it was just the 2 of us. She did not turn around immediately. I stood near the door and let her have the moment. When she turned, she had the data slate in her hand. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, not anger, not calculation, something considerate and more careful than either of those. The expression of a precise person holding a measurement that had just proved more accurate than expected and was deciding what to do with the new information. You were at Karivan, she said. Yes, I said. Every Volthri military historian knows what happened at Karivan, she said. The human who held the corridor. It was in the briefings when I studied Alliance military history. They did not include a name in the public record. She looked at the slate, then back at me. I did not know the name. Most people do not, I said. Why did you not tell me? I answered her the same way I had answered Croft. Because it was the true answer, and she deserved it. I wanted you to know me before you knew what I had done. I was concerned the record would become a wall between an honest conversation and the version of me that the file describes. Those are not entirely the same thing. The record describes someone extraordinary, she said. The record describes a job, I said, done for a long time under difficult conditions, by someone who was adequately prepared and fortunate enough to survive. I am not dismissing what is in it, but it is not the whole of me, and I did not want it to arrive before I did. She set the slate on the table. Sorvik told me, after the selection, that I had made a political error, that you had no bloodline value, no strategic alliance weight, no useful court position. She looked at me steadily. I told him I had not chosen you for any of those things. What did you tell him you chose me for? That you were the only person in that room who was not performing something for me, she said. That everyone else was showing me what they wanted me to see. You were simply present, not hiding, not showing, just there. She paused. I have been queen for 11 years. There is always a calculation in a room with me. You were the first person in a very long time who offered an honest room instead. I know how to calculate, I said. I chose not to. Why? Because you deserved it, I said, even if it was only one person offering it. She looked at me for a long time. I am not angry, she said. About the file. About the omission. I want you to understand that clearly. She reached out and touched the edge of the slate without picking it up. I am recalibrating. When I chose you, I chose on instinct. My instinct told me you had already been through the worst of things and come out of it whole. I did not know the specifics. I know them now. And the person the file describes, I have been watching that person for 3 weeks. He is the one who accepted a physical trial and described it as a light workout. The one who adjusted my security without mentioning it. The one who found an intelligence asset outside his door and reported it as a fall. She paused. The file does not contradict what I saw. It explains it. That is an accurate summary, I said. Something crossed her expression, the almost smile that lived in the neighborhood of warmth, without quite arriving there. Are you protecting me? She asked. The question was direct and quiet, and stripped of every layer of formality. I thought about the listening device, and the unscheduled guards, and the 3 guards I had been building a working relationship with, and every exit I had mapped, and every threat assessment I had been running in the back of my mind since my first morning in the palace. I am protecting this household, I said. You are part of it. She looked at me. I looked back. That, she said, very quietly, may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 11 years. I did not have a response to that. I thought it probably did not require one. She picked up the data slate and set it on a side shelf, face down, not discarding it, but filing it, acknowledging it and placing it correctly, in its right position relative to everything else. The Western Trade Delegation meets again tomorrow morning, she said. Sorvek will have the full briefing for you by this evening. I will review it tonight, I said. Good, she said. And then, as I turned for the door, Owen, I stopped. Thank you, she said, for the honest room. I nodded once. I left in the corridor. Croft was waiting with the expression of a man who had been reading a closed door and gotten about half of it. How did she take it? He said. Well, I said. He nodded slowly. She is not an easy person to surprise. No, I agreed. She is not. I walked back toward my quarters. Through the long window at the corridor's end, I could see the city stretching to the horizon in the morning light. Behind me, Seralith was back at her table, working through the business of an empire with the same focused precision she brought to everything. And somewhere in a server partition that 4 people in the galaxy had clearance to access, a file sat quiet and undisturbed. I had a feeling it was about to become relevant again. Not because I wanted it to be, but because the kind of quiet I had come here looking for was a complicated thing to maintain, and the palace had too many moving parts, and some of those parts were already moving in directions I had identified and did not like. I had 60 days by my estimate, possibly less. I found the first real indicator on a Tuesday. Philip had left a trade summary on my secondary reading table, standard material, the kind of document that contained no surprises if you read it as a trade summary. I did not read it as a trade summary. I read it the way I had been trained to read anything that moved information between parties, which meant I was reading the gaps as much as the content, the things that were not said, the routing decisions that revealed more about the sender's actual concerns than any of the stated positions. The Theskari Empire had been requesting expanded access to the Veilthari inner transit lanes for 8 months. The formal position was commercial, fuel efficiency gains, reduced shipping times, mutual economic benefit. The Queen's Trade Office had been managing the negotiation with standard diplomatic patience, pushing for reciprocal concessions and taking their time. 8 months of patient negotiation was entirely normal. What was not normal was the supplementary routing request buried in paragraph 9 of the annex, asking for temporary authorization for a class of vessels designated as administrative support carriers. Administrative support carriers, in standard Thescari fleet classification, had a secondary designation that the Trade Office had apparently not cross-referenced. The secondary designation was Rapid Troop Transfer. I set the document down. I stood at my window and thought through what I had just read and what it connected to. 3 weeks ago, an external intelligence asset had attempted to access my file. The attempt had come from Thescari intelligence. At the time, Croft had assessed it as standard surveillance, building a file on the Queen's household. That was the obvious reading. The other reading, the one I had been sitting with since Croft told me about the access attempt, was that the Thescari were not only surveilling, they were assessing. They were checking whether there was anything in the Queen's household that represented an unpredicted variable, a complication to a plan they were already running. A plan that, if the administrative support carrier request was what I now believed it to be, involved having rapid deployment vessels inside the inner transit lanes before anyone understood their purpose. I went to find Philip. He was in his office, a narrow room adjacent to the protocol wing containing 3 active screens, 2 stacks of physical documents, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. He was cross-referencing invitation lists for the state dinner in 2 days, the kind of precise, unglamorous work that kept the palace functioning. "Philip," I said, "I need the full guest manifest for the state dinner, not the public version. The security-level version with origin affiliations and secondary party invitations." He looked at me. "That requires Director Croft's authorization." "Call him," I said. "Tell him I need it within the hour." Something in my tone registered. He reached for his communication unit without another question. While he made the call, I took a sheet of physical paper. Physical paper leaves no access logs, and began sketching what I had. 3 entry points of concern. 2 noble house factions whose communications had gone notably quiet over the previous 2 weeks. The kind of quiet that follows a decision rather than a lull. The Thescari transit request, the intelligence probe on my file, and the detail I had not yet shared with anyone. The 2 unscheduled guards I had now confirmed on 3 separate evenings at the Eastern Station. Guard rotations ran on a fixed schedule. These 2 were not on it. When I had asked Philip about it, the answer had come back as temporary transfers from the outer garrison, routine administrative reassignment. Routine administrative reassignment did not explain why both men had been observed separately in conversation with a minor court official I had identified as a likely House Velkar contact. I circled that on the paper. Croft arrived 11 minutes after Philip's call. He came directly, which meant he had already been in motion. He closed the office door, looked at the paper on the table, and said nothing for a moment. "Talk to me," he said. I walked him through it. He was a good listener, professional, non-interrupting, the kind of intelligence officer who takes in information before forming an opinion rather than the other way around. When I finished, he sat back and looked at the list. "The transit request was flagged by our commercial team as routine," he said. "The commercial team did not have the secondary flight classification index," I said. "No," he said, "they would not." He paused. "You do." "I did," I said. "Previously. The information is current." He studied the paper. "The 2 guards. You are certain about the contact observation?" "I am certain about what I observed," I said. "I am offering an interpretation. You may have context that changes it." "I don't," he said. "I have been monitoring House Velkar communications for the last 2 weeks based on a separate concern. What you are describing is consistent with what I have been seeing." He paused. "You have been running a parallel assessment." "I have been paying attention," I said, "since the 2nd day. You should have come to me sooner," he said. "I did not have enough to be useful sooner," I said. "Now I do." He stood. "I need to brief the Queen today." "Not yet," I said. He stopped. "Why?" "Because if we brief her now before we know the full shape of it, her responses will be visible to the people watching her responses. The network will read the change in her behavior and adjust their timeline." I leaned forward. "Give me 48 hours. I need to confirm 2 additional things. If I am right, we move before the state dinner. If I am wrong, we brief her with the full picture and she decides." Croft looked at me for a long assessing moment. He was not a man who trusted easily. He was also a professional, and professionals know when another approach has seen something they have not. 48 hours, he said. "Then we go to her together." Agreed. 2 unscheduled guards. "What do you want to do about them?" "Nothing," I said. "Let them keep to the pattern." Watched guards change their behavior. "Unnoticed ones give you information." He nodded. He left. Philip looked at me from behind his screens. He had heard everything. "Sir," he said, "what do you need from me?" "My schedule for the next 2 days needs to look exactly like a consort with no particular concerns attending to his normal calendar," I said. "Meals, afternoon review, protocol briefing for the state dinner. Visible and routine. Done," he said, and turned to his screens without another word. I spent the next 48 hours in 2 modes simultaneously. On the surface, I attended every scheduled appointment, ate every meal on time, reviewed the state dinner protocol document in the presence of 2 staff members who would report my behavior as calm and unremarkable. Underneath that, in the margin hours, I confirmed both of the outstanding pieces. The first, the state dinner guest list, contained 3 attendees from the Thescari diplomatic mission, whose listed roles did not match their physical profiles. I had been around enough people in operational roles to recognize the difference between a trade official and someone who was present for a different reason. These 3 were present for a different reason. The second, the service corridor that ran behind the eastern residential wing, the one I had identified on day 4 as a viable transit route and had been maintaining in a state of quiet readiness since, was still clear. I checked it at midnight on the second night, walking its length in the dark with no light source, which was fine because I had walked it enough times to know it exactly. I went to Croft at dawn on the 3rd day. We went to Saralith together. She listened to the full briefing without interruption. She asked 4 questions, all of them precise and none of them ones I had not already considered. At the end, she looked at me. "You have been running this for weeks," she said. "Yes," I said. "The room preparation on the maintenance level, the guard relationships, the service corridor verification." "Day 4 for the room," I said. "The guards over the following 2 weeks, the corridor ongoing." She was quiet for a moment. "When you told me you were protecting the household, I meant it exactly," I said. She nodded once and turned to Croft. "What do we need?" The 3 of us spent the next 4 hours building a response. Croft managed the outer coordination. I handled the inner architecture. Saralith made the decisions, which was correct and right. She was the one who understood the full political weight of each choice, and she was sharper than either of us at reading which response would close doors rather than open them. By the time we finished, I had 41 hours before the planned move. Not much room, enough. They came on a Thursday. The state dinner was the trigger point. I had estimated it as the most likely moment because it provided cover for unusual movement, a concentrated gathering in one location, and a temporary disruption to the normal guard pattern. I had been right about all 3. What I had not predicted with full accuracy was the scale. 300 was the number Croft and I were working with by dawn on Thursday, assembled from overnight intercepts and the pattern analysis we had been building for a week. 300 was not a reactive insurgent unit. It was a statement, enough force to be decisive, not so much as to constitute a formal act of war, sitting deliberately in the space between a palace incident and an international event. Professionally planned, the Thescari advisors behind it understood deniability architecture. The Noble House partners understood the positioning. The 2 unscheduled guards at the Eastern Station understood their role, which was to open a gap in the inner ward rotation at the critical moment, so the first strike team could move on the Queen's private wing without resistance. They had planned it carefully. They had not planned for me. At 4:47 in the morning, I moved Saralith, not with a full security detail, which would have been visible on every monitoring system. Not through the main corridors, which were the obvious evacuation routes and therefore the obvious interdiction points. Through the service passage that ran behind the eastern residential wing. The one that existed in the building schematics but had not appeared on any tactical planning document in 40 years, because nobody had thought to include a maintenance corridor in an operational assessment. She was awake when I arrived at her chamber. I did not ask how she had known something was coming. She was a precise and attentive person, and she had been watching me for weeks, and she had her own read on the temperature of the building. She was dressed in functional clothing, not formal wear, and she had a small case that she had packed herself. I noted both things and did not comment on them. "How many?" she said as we moved into the passage. "Estimated 300 total," I said. 12 already inside the compound. Main force staged in the lower market district, waiting on the confirmation signal from the eastern station. "What happens when the signal doesn't come?" "They hold and reevaluate," I said. "We have a window." The prepared room in the maintenance level was everything I had made it over the previous weeks. Reinforced door. Separate communication lines on a circuit independent from the palace main system. The physical bolt that no electronic override could touch. I had stalked it quietly over 14 days through a sequence of small, individually unremarkable maintenance requests. None of the requests had drawn attention because none of them, individually, meant anything. I showed her the sidearm, a compact, well-balanced model, in 60 seconds. 3 things to know. She listened once and did not ask me to repeat any of it. If anyone comes through that door, I said, and it is not me and it is not Philip or Croft, treat it as hostile. She looked at the weapon, then at me. You are going back up. Yes, alone. Croft is managing the outer response. I need the inside clear. She was quiet for a moment. I checked the bolt, confirmed the secondary line was active, and moved toward the passage door. Owen, she said. I stopped. Come back, she said. Simple, direct, no additional frame around it. She meant it exactly as she said it. That is the plan, I said. I went back up into the palace. What followed was not clean. I will not describe it as anything other than what it was. 2 hours of difficult, focused work in a building I knew more thoroughly than the people moving through it. The 12 confirmed actors were spread through the east and central wings in a configuration designed to control movement and communication. It was a good configuration, built on the assumption that anyone defending against it would be working from the same floor plans they were using. They were not working from my floor plans. I had been living in this building for weeks, with the particular attention of a person whose survival instincts never fully clock out. I knew where the stone absorbed sound and where it carried it. I knew which columns gave true cover. I knew 3 routes between any 2 points that did not appear on the primary schematics. I knew the rhythm of the building at 5 in the morning, what it normally sounded like, and therefore what the deviations meant. The 12 did not know me. They knew a civilian record, a diplomatic career, a man who had finished a bread roll and accepted a queen's selection without ceremony. Their assessment of the threat I represented was built on a file that was not my file. I worked the East Wing first, because that was where their internal command node was. The unit leader managing the operation, and waiting for the confirmation signal from the Eastern Station. That signal was never going to come. The 3 guards I had briefed 2 days earlier had repositioned overnight, and the 2 unscheduled additions were no longer in a position to send anything to anyone. The unit leader did not know this yet. He was managing a plan that had already lost its center. I worked through the palace methodically, using the silence and the building and the 38 minutes of undisturbed operation time before the outer force began to wonder why their confirmation had not arrived. The work was quiet, and it was not complicated once you understood the geometry of the situation, which I did, because I had been building that understanding since day 4. By the time the outer force's own intelligence indicated something had gone wrong, inside the internal unit was no longer a factor, and Croft's outer remosts teams were moving to contain the main force in the market district. The outer force stood down. They had no protocol for a scenario in which the entire internal operation collapsed before the main force even reached the compound wall. They had not believed this outcome was possible. This is the problem with plans built on incorrect assumptions. The assumption that had failed them was a simple one. They had assumed I was who my civilian jacket said I was. I returned to the maintenance level at 7:14 in the morning. I knocked on the door, said my name, and waited. The bolt drew back. Saralith opened the door. She looked at me with the steady, composed expression she wore when she was doing the work of not showing what she was actually feeling. Her eyes went immediately to my forearm, where a graze from a ricocheted shot in the east corridor had darkened the sleeve. Superficial, I said before she could ask. Sit down, she said. She found the medical kit I had stored in the supply shelf. I had included basic supplies because I planned for realistic outcomes, and she dealt with the wound with the same focused precision she brought to everything. No fuss. No unnecessary words. The secondary communication line chimed. Croft's voice confirmed the outer stand-down and declared the compound secure. Saralith set the kit aside and sat back. We were both quiet. 300, she said, roughly. The outer force never engaged. Croft has the formal response. She nodded. She was not shaken. She was processing the active, structured processing of a person whose mind was already 3 steps into the decisions that needed to follow. You had prepared all of this before we even briefed together, she said. Before I had enough to bring to you, I said. 4 days before the event. Day 4 for the room, I said. The rest built from there. She looked at me. All of that quietly, with no indication to anyone watching you. The indication would have warned them, I said. Partial alarm without the ability to act on it is not protection. It is just fear with nowhere to go. I did not want that for you. She was quiet again, outside and above us. The palace was reorganizing around the event. Croft's people moving through corridors, staff receiving instructions. the sounds of an institution processing something large. That afternoon in the outer reception hall, they brought Lord Henrik of House Velkar before the Queen in chains. He was the primary noble contact, the one who had coordinated the internal network, recruited the unscheduled guards, and arranged the Theskari integration into what he had believed was an airtight plan. I was standing to one side, arm freshly bandaged, holding something warm that Philip had quietly provided. Henrik was escorted in by 4 palace guards, and he looked across the hall with the expression of a man revising a catastrophically wrong model of the world. He stared at me for a long moment. I was told, he said, with the flat tone of real shock poorly contained, that the human consort was a diplomatic placement, a civilian figure, no operational significance. I looked at him over my cup. People keep saying that, I said. The months that followed were the most unusual and, unexpectedly, the most satisfying of my life. That statement requires context, and the context is this. I had spent 24 years in work that demanded everything and returned little except the knowledge that the task had been completed. There is meaning in that. I have never tried to minimize it, but meaning and satisfaction are different things, and I had not been certain, when I handed in my retirement papers and walked out of the last facility I would ever formally call home, whether satisfaction was something I still had the capacity for. The palace kept surprising me. The court changed after the coup. Not completely. Old institutions do not change completely, and I was not naive enough to expect that. But the quality of the silence when I entered a room shifted. The small political maneuvers that had characterized the early weeks, the careful marginalization, the performed condescension, went quiet. Not out of fear exactly, more out of a deep and genuine recalibration. The court had revised its working model, and the revised model required different behavior. Lady Velkar lost her formal standing following the investigation. Lord Aerith, whose involvement had been peripheral and deniable, survived but became notably warmer in his address to me. The warmth of a man who has decided that the tactical landscape has changed and is updating his position accordingly. Duke Norath, who had arranged the challenge, began consulting me on military security assessments with the directness of someone who had decided to work with the situation rather than against it. I still declined all military titles. Sarilith offered 3, with varying degrees of political weight, and I declined each one with the same reasoning, that the titles belonged to a chapter that was no longer the current one. I was the royal consort. That was my position. That was sufficient. What I had not fully anticipated was what that meant in practice. It meant long mornings in the working chambers alongside her, reading the daily governance briefs, not as a formal advisor, but as a second set of trained eyes with a different kind of background. She valued this not because I had authority, but because I had a different frame, and she was precise enough in her own thinking to know when an outside angle was genuinely useful, versus when it was extra noise. She told me which was which, and I found her judgments accurate, which I found satisfying in the way that working with a skilled person is always satisfying. It meant evenings that shifted, gradually and without announcement, from formal to something more honest. The first time she poured the tea herself. There were always staff available for this, and she had never done it in my presence before. I noted it without commenting on it. The second time she did it, I thanked her. The third time, it was simply how it was. Philip noticed things like this, as he noticed everything, and reported none of it to anyone, which I considered one of his many excellent qualities. It meant learning Kael'thos. The concept does not translate directly into human language. The closest approximation sits somewhere between unconditional respect and the honor of a choice that asks for nothing in return, but even that description loses something in the translation. Sarilith explained it to me on an evening when we had both come to the conversation, tired from a long day of trade reviews and the formal layers had been set aside. In Veilthari tradition, she said, there is a distinction between choosing someone for what they can offer you and choosing someone for what they are. The first is a transaction. The second is Kael'thos. Which was the selection? I asked. She looked at me steadily. You already know the answer. I wanted to hear you say it, I said. Something moved across her expression, real warmth, present rather than managed. Kael'thos, she said. I thought about it for a while. We do not have a word for it, I said. We have approximations, loyalty, devotion, commitment, but they all carry conditions. They imply a relationship of exchange. Perhaps humans do not need the word, she said, because you demonstrate the thing more readily than you define it. I considered that. That may be the kindest thing anyone has said about humans in a diplomatic context. I have access to many diplomatic contexts, she said. The competition was not strong. That was the first time I actually laughed, a real one, unmanaged, not the polite social sound I had been producing at events. It surprised her. She looked at me with the expression I had learned, over months, to read correctly, pleased and engaged, and for once not attempting to contain either. Croft came to me 4 weeks after the coup with a professional assessment that I noted carried personal weight behind it. The Intelligence Directorate has been reviewing your handling of the pre-event period, he said. The assessment is, unanimous, that your approach was operationally correct. Gathering before briefing, allowing the pattern to develop before closing on it. He paused. There was a secondary note in the assessment. One of the reviewing directors wanted me to pass it along. What did it say? That a person with your record, deployed in a palace intelligence function with no formal title or mandate, working entirely from personal initiative, achieved an outcome that a formal agency deployment would likely not have matched. He looked at me over the top of his notes. The director used the word extraordinary. He asked whether you had ever considered a consultancy arrangement. Tell him no, I said. Croft nodded. Unsurprised, I expected that answer. Tell him the floors are heated, I said. Croft almost smiled. It was the closest I had seen him come to it. I will pass along a diplomatic version of that sentiment, he said. Philip told me, 2 months after the coup, that the court had developed an informal title for me. He delivered this information with the careful neutrality he used when he was not entirely sure how I would receive something. They call you in private the still one, he said. It refers to your eyes. The observation the Queen made at the selection. I know, I said. I have heard it. It is not said negatively said, it is said carefully. The way you say a thing when you are not entirely sure what it contains. Good, I said. Uncertainty keeps people honest. He nodded. Then, with the deliberate care of someone's choosing to say a personal thing, Sir, are you happy here? I looked out the window. The city lay to the horizon. The courtyard below moved with the ordinary rhythm of a large institution going about its work. Staff crossing between buildings, supply vehicles on their rounds, the afternoon guard rotation beginning its cycle in the outer yard. 14 visible, I noted automatically. Probably 4 more in positions I could not directly see. Old habits, I said. He nodded once, satisfied, and returned to his work without further comment. I meant it. The question she asked me, on an evening 2 months after the coup when we were both tired, and the conversation had moved past the formal layer into the more honest territory that had become the standard between us, was not the hardest question she had ever asked me. But it was the one I thought about most. Were you happy? She said. In the wars. I sat with the honest answer for a moment. No, I said. Were you good at it? Yes, I said. Very. And that gap between being very good at something and not being happy in it, how did you carry it for so long? I looked at the window. You focus on what is directly in front of you, the task, the person, the immediate situation. You keep the larger frame accessible for context, but you do not live in it. If you live in the full weight of it all the time, the weight stops you. She was quiet. You do the same thing, I said. She turned to look at me. What do you mean? Running an empire, I said. You are very good at it. I have watched you work for months. You are precise. You are fair. You are considerably more strategically capable than your senior advisors credit. You 4. But you do not carry the full weight of it all the time. You put it down when you can. When you read in the evenings. When the conversation is real instead of formal. I paused. That is the same mechanism. I recognized it the first week. She looked at me steadily. You noticed that. I notice things, I said. You notice everything, she said, and the tone was not a complaint. Old habit, I said. A silence settled between us. The kind that has things in it. The kind that does not need to be filled. Are you happy now? Here. I thought about the bread rolls and the fork etiquette I still occasionally misread. I thought about Philip's focused efficiency and Croft's careful professional respect, and the 3 guards who now greeted me by name every morning, without ceremony. I thought about the working chambers and the morning briefs and the evenings that had shifted from formal to honest without either of us announcing that they had. The pension is still better, I said. She made a sound, short, genuine, surprised, and it became the real laugh I had been hearing more of lately, the one she did not manage or contain. That is a terrible answer, she said. It is a very honest one, I said. She looked at me. I looked back. Yes, I said. I am happy. She smiled, not the almost smile, not the managed version, a full, unhidden smile that she made no effort to contain. Given who she was and the discipline with which she held herself in public, I understood that to be roughly equivalent to someone else laughing out loud with relief. I thought, looking at that smile, that it was the most honest thing I had seen in 11 years of my own life. That, she said quietly, is the answer I was going to wait for. How long were you prepared to wait? I said. As long as it took, she said. I have been patient about important things before. The evening had gone fully dark outside the window. The palace had settled into its quieter night rhythms around us. We sat in the working chamber with the lamps on, and the day's documents still spread between us, not working, simply present in the same space in the way that had become natural, without either of us noting when that had happened. What happens now, she said. Not about the Theskari, not about the court. She meant it simply, the way you ask a simple question when the complicated version has already been answered. We do the work, I said. You run the empire. I watch the edges. We have the honest conversations. Is that enough? She asked. I thought about the word. About what enough meant when you had been moving through the world without it for a long time, and then stopped moving and found yourself in a room with heated floors and a queen who poured the tea herself and meant every word she said. For me, I said, yes, that is exactly enough. The quiet that settled was the good kind, the kind that has things in it without needing them said. Philip had told me, the week before, that a formal inquiry had arrived from the Interstellar Alliance diplomatic office asking whether the royal consort would be available for a cross-species security advisory panel being assembled for the following quarter. The inquiry had used my name specifically, which told me the story of the coup and its resolution had moved through channels faster than I had expected. I had declined. I asked Philip to send the decline with no explanation beyond existing commitments, which was accurate. He sent it without comment. Then quietly, without making a moment of it, he had said, Sir, for what it is worth, the people here are better for your being here. I had not had a clean response to that. I had nodded. He had returned to his work, but I had thought about it afterward, about what better meant in practice, about whether I believed it, about whether it was the kind of thing that could land in a person who had spent 24 years in work designed to keep feeling at a functional distance. It landed. For 24 years I had been good at work that happened at a remove from the people it protected. You knew the math. The corridor held. The relay went down. The team came home. You trusted the outcome without ever sitting across a table from the life you had maintained and watching it. Drink tea and argue with the trade ministry and smile without managing the smile. This was different. This I could see directly in front of me. That was worth more than I had expected to find. Croft came to me on a quiet morning 6 weeks later. He sat down with the settled calm of a man who had already decided how to frame what he was about to say. The Theskari Empire, he said, has sent a diplomatic inquiry through the secondary channel, officially framed as a household stability assessment following recent events. Standard language. It is not a stability assessment, I said. No, he said. Our signals analysis indicates fleet element repositioning along the outer boundary. The inquiry is a preliminary probe. They are testing whether the situation here is exploitable. I thought through the shape of it, the timeline, the pressure points, the vulnerabilities a competent assessment would identify. Their current intelligence report on this household, I said. What would it say about me? Croft looked at me with an expression that I had come to read as his version of professional appreciation. No noble blood, no political title, no formal military rank. Civilian consort. The operative assessment would classify the household as he stopped. Understaffed at the top, I said. Approximately, he said. I picked up a sheet of paper. I wrote a single set of notes, timeline, probable move date, recommended counterpositioning, and pushed it across the table. He read it. He looked up. I went to find Saralith. She was in the working chamber, moving through the morning dispatches with the focused economy she brought to everything. She looked up when I came in. I set the note on the table in front of her. She read it. She was quiet for a moment, and I watched her do what I had watched her do many times now. Hold the full weight of the information, assess it without performing the assessment, and arrive at a decision. She reached for the stylus. She signed her name in the margin. Beside it, in the Veilthari formal register, she added a single word, jointly. She pushed the note back to me. When do we begin, she said. I looked at the note. I looked at her. I thought about 24 years and what they had cost, and what they had built, and the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who understood the weight of things without requiring them to be explained first. We already have, I said. She nodded once and turned back to her dispatches. I sat down across the table and pulled the secondary brief toward me and began to read. Outside, the city moved through its morning, the courtyard filled with the sounds of an ordinary day. The carved walls of the palace held their long record of everything that had come before. Every alliance, every treaty, every act of state, patient and permanent. And in a working chamber in the imperial palace of the Veilthari, a queen and her consort sat across a table in the clean, full quiet of two people who had both been through the worst of things and found, unexpectedly, their way to this, useful, present, and enough. I looked across the table at her as she turned to the next dispatch, and I thought about the 46-page file sitting in its classified partition, undisturbed, belonging to a chapter that had already been filed. I thought about Caravan, and the Null Corridor, and the Thescuri Relay, and every cold corridor, and dark extraction, and long holding action that had been the shape of my working life for 2 decades. I did not think about them with regret. You cannot regret the decisions that kept you and the people beside you alive. But you can recognize, without guilt, that those years had taken something from you that is not a military classification and does not appear in a commendations list. A kind of capacity for ordinary life that goes quiet when it is not used and has to be relearned slowly in conditions of safety. The palace was safe, not because nothing happened here. Because when things happened here, I could handle them, and the handling was known and finite and left room on the other side for this. A morning, a table, a person worth protecting. Saralith signed the last dispatch of the morning and set it aside. She looked up and found me watching her, which I had not been attempting to conceal. "You are thinking again," she said. "I am always thinking," I said. "You are thinking something specific," she said. "You get a particular expression." "What kind of expression?" She considered it. "Satisfied," she said. "Like a person who has solved a problem they did not expect to solve." I thought about that. "That is accurate," I said. She nodded, returned to her work, and did not ask me to elaborate, which was one of the things I had come to value most about her. She trusted the things I said and did not require the things I did not say, and she had the rare discipline to know the difference between the two. Outside, the city went on. The empire went on. The carved walls held their record of everything that had come before, and somewhere in a server partition, my file sat classified and undisturbed, belonging to a chapter that no longer needed to announce itself. I was Owen Garrett, royal consort, still one, the man with quiet eyes and a heated floor and exactly enough. That was all. That was everything.